The conference room was quiet, the hum of city life muffled by thick glass walls that separated us from the world beyond. I glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. The room was dim except for the soft glow of the screen we'd been working on. I could feel the fatigue creeping in, but I knew better than to complain. I wasn't about to squander a chance to work alongside Mr. Harris. After all, he'd taught me almost everything I knew. He sat across the table, his eyes focused, brow furrowed in concentration as he scanned the last few slides of our presentation. His gray hair caught the faint light, giving him a dignified, almost ethereal presence that added to his natural authority. Though he was in his 70s, there was a vitality to him that defied age. I'd always admired his ability to command a room effortlessly, his quiet wisdom that resonated even when he said little. Tonight, however, felt different. There was an unusual warmth in his gaze each time he looked up from his work. It was subtle, a barely there smile as he caught me watching him. I wasn't sure if he noticed or if he was letting me notice him in a way that had never happened before. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant for the lives we end up leading?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. It was a question he'd never ask in the typical hustle of our daytime meetings, where every second mattered. But tonight, as the city lights danced through the glass and cast us in their glow, his words felt like they'd been waiting to be spoken. I paused, considering his question. It was rare for Mr. Harris to let his guard down, to hint at the thoughts behind his composed exterior. "I think we find purpose in our choices," I replied, carefully. "But sometimes it feels like the choices find us first." He smiled, a bit wistful, and looked back at the screen, yet I sensed he wasn't really seeing it. "It's funny," he said after a beat. "I spent years thinking the next promotion, the next merger, all of it would bring a kind of fulfillment. And here I am." He gestured around the empty room, "with everything I once thought I wanted." His voice trailed off, and for a moment I saw him differently, no longer as the polished executive, but as a person simply and entirely reflecting on his life. I felt the weight of his words settle between us, unspoken but present. "And does it?" I asked softly, feeling as though I were intruding on something deeply personal. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Does it make you feel fulfilled?" There was a long silence, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the streets below. Finally, he sighed, a gentle sound full of years and memories. "I suppose it's complicated," he said, his tone low. "The things we chase often give us what we think we want, but sometimes we realize too late that what we truly need is something different." He leaned back, folding his hands thoughtfully. The lines on his face softened as he looked at me, and I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't just the words, but the way he spoke them, as though they held layers of meaning that went far beyond the professional distance we usually kept. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he admitted, his eyes fixed on me. "You have your whole life ahead of you, after all. It's not fair to burden you with regrets." "It's not a burden," I replied, and I meant it. "If anything, I don't know. I think everyone needs to know that even people who seem to have it all together are figuring things out." I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a pull toward him that I couldn't quite name. He nodded, his expression softening further as he studied my face, his gaze lingering in a way that made my heart skip. "Thank you," he said, his voice gentle. "You're a rare soul, you know that." I felt a blush creep up my neck, unsure how to respond. This wasn't how things were supposed to go with Mr. Harris, yet it felt natural, as if this moment had always been there, just waiting for the right time. His hand rested on the table between us, close enough that I could see every detail: the veins, the faint scars of a life well lived. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand next to his. Our fingers brushed, barely touching, but the simple contact sent a jolt through me. For a moment we stayed like that, hands resting close, a silent conversation in the space between our fingers. He looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before, and I felt as if he were seeing me, truly seeing me, in a way no one else ever had. "I should probably finish these notes," he murmured, though he made no move to pull his hand away. The air in the room felt thick with tension, the kind that words couldn't fully express. I couldn't bring myself to speak, afraid that breaking the silence might shatter whatever was happening between us. After a moment, he slowly intertwined his fingers with mine, his touch light but steady. I held my breath, the world narrowing down to the warmth of his hand in mine, the weight of his gaze as he watched me. "This isn't appropriate," he murmured. Yet his hand remained clasped around mine, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a thrill, a quiet, almost reverent moment of connection that felt more intense than anything I'd experienced before. And though neither of us moved, the unspoken electricity in the air left me breathless. We stayed that way, caught in a moment that felt both fragile and unbreakable. His hand in mine held a kind of quiet strength, a reassurance that neither of us seemed ready to let go. He was still looking at me with that steady, contemplative gaze, as if he were memorizing every detail, every shift in my expression. I didn't want the moment to end. I never imagined, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, that I'd feel something like this. Not here, not at this point in my life. His eyes softened, the vulnerability there catching me off guard. I'd always known him as the composed executive, the one with all the answers, yet here he was, letting me see the parts of himself he usually kept hidden from the world. I felt a strange courage swell inside me, a need to bridge the distance between us. Neither did I replied, my voice equally soft. But maybe that's why it matters. His lips curved into a faint, almost bittersweet smile. You always see through to the heart of things. The words were simple, but the way he said them, like a confession, made my heart pound. Slowly, he released my hand, though the warmth of his touch lingered as he leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving mine. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. And then, as if compelled by a force beyond reason, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing the side of my face, tracing a light path along my cheek. It was a gesture so intimate, so achingly tender, that it made my breath catch. "Do you ever think about the paths we don't take?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his hand lingering against my cheek. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. There was something in his touch, a question, a longing that resonated with my own hidden feelings, ones I'd kept carefully tucked away. My hand moved up to cover his, holding it there against my face. Maybe some paths lead back to each other," I replied, the words escaping before I could second-guess them. His eyes darkened, a flicker of something unnamed and intense passing between us. The walls of the conference room, the desks and monitors, seemed to blur, leaving only the two of us in a world all our own. His thumb brushed along my cheekbone, his touch deliberate and slow, as if savoring the moment. I closed my eyes, letting myself lean into it, feeling the warmth and reassurance in his hand. There was a comfort here, a feeling of being truly understood, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. When I opened my eyes, he was closer, his face inches from mine, his gaze searching, as if waiting for permission. And in that suspended moment, I knew that neither of us could go back. This feels inevitable, doesn't it?" he murmured, his breath mingling with mine. "Yes," I whispered, my heart pounding as I closed the distance between us. The first brush of his lips was light, tentative, as though testing the boundaries of this new reality. But when I didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss, his hand moving to the back of my neck, holding me steady. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the warmth and solidity of him beneath my fingers. There was a hunger there, a yearning that had built slowly over the years, now unleashed in this single, fragile moment. His fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, our breaths mingling in a rhythm that felt as old as time. It was as if all the tension, the unspoken words and glances, had led to this, and now that we were here, there was no turning back. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, his forehead resting gently against mine as we held each other in the quiet aftermath. "I didn't plan for this," he said softly, his voice tinged with wonder, "but I don't regret it." "Neither do I replied, my voice shaking slightly. There was a vulnerability in the air, a rawness that left me feeling exposed and yet, somehow, whole. For a long moment we stayed there, wrapped in each other's arms, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between us. And though we both knew this moment couldn't last, that we'd have to return to the world beyond these walls, for now, this was enough. The room was quiet, wrapped in a kind of reverent stillness. We lingered, unwilling to break the spell that bound us, feeling the warmth radiating between us, our breath sinking as we absorbed the intensity of what had just happened. My hands rested on his shoulders, fingers tracing gentle circles, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we had just discovered. He held me with a tenderness that spoke of a care and understanding I hadn't known I'd been searching for. After a moment, he pulled back slightly, his eyes scanning my face with a soft, almost searching look. "You have a way of surprising me," he murmured, his voice laced with something tender, something that reached into the depths of me and tugged at emotions I couldn't yet name. I smiled, a warmth spreading through me at his words. Maybe we both needed to be surprised," I whispered, brushing my thumb along the edge of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness there that grounded me in the reality of this moment. He chuckled softly, a sound so warm and rich it sent shivers through me. "I've spent my life building walls," he said quietly, his fingers tracing along my arm, lingering as if to memorize every sensation, "and somehow you found a way through them." I felt a swell of emotion, a gratitude for this rare moment of vulnerability he was sharing with me. "Sometimes the walls we build are there to protect something worth sharing," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. His gaze softened, a flicker of understanding passing between us that felt like a silent promise, an acknowledgement of the emotions that had brought us to this point. His hand moved to rest on my waist, pulling me gently closer until there was no space left between us. I leaned into him, my cheek brushing against his as he held me, the weight of our shared silence filling the room with a palpable tension. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I felt a thrill, a quiet, almost reverent sensation of being seen, truly seen in a way that few people ever experience. For a long moment, neither of us moved, caught in the delicate balance between the pull of desire and the knowledge that this was new, fragile, and precious. And then his lips found mine again, a soft, lingering kiss that held a gentleness, a care that took my breath away. Each touch, each brush of his fingertips along my back, felt like a revelation, a step further into a world we were creating, moment by moment. I could feel his heartbeat beneath my palm, steady yet quickened, echoing the racing of my own pulse. The conference room, once a sterile environment of polished tables and sleek screens, had transformed into something intimate, a cocoon that held only us and the quiet intensity of our connection. The city lights outside cast a soft glow, silhouetting our forms, making the room feel suspended in time. As our kiss deepened, a quiet urgency began to build, a sense that this was inevitable, a culmination of unspoken moments and glances shared over the years. His hands moved slowly, reverently, each touch deliberate, and I felt myself melt under his care, surrendering to the undeniable chemistry between us. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice a low murmur against my ear. There was something in his tone, a hesitation, a need to know that this was real, that we were both making the same choice. I looked up into his eyes, seeing a vulnerability there, a longing that matched my own. "Yes," I whispered back, my voice steady with certainty. "I've never been more sure." With that, he pulled me closer, his hands steady, his touch full of quiet resolve. There was a new intensity in the air, a feeling that we were crossing a line that had been drawn long ago, yet felt destined to be erased. Each touch, each kiss, felt charged with the weight of years, a release of emotions held back for too long. Time slipped away as we stayed wrapped in each other's embrace, exploring this new reality we'd created, savoring each sensation as though it were the first and the last. His hands moved over me with a care that left me breathless, each touch a reassurance that this was right, that we were exactly where we were meant to be. As the night wore on, the city lights dimmed, and we found ourselves lying on the conference room floor, tangled together in the soft glow of the early morning. His hand traced gentle patterns along my arm, his breathing steady and warm against my neck. We lay in comfortable silence, the weight of what we'd shared settling over us, leaving us both with a sense of peace and exhilaration. Finally he spoke, his voice a quiet murmur. "I didn't realize how much I needed this," he confessed, his fingers lacing through mine. "It's been so long since I felt connected." There was a vulnerability in his words, a raw honesty that left me feeling both moved and humbled. I tightened my grip on his hand, pressing a soft kiss to his shoulder. "Me too," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. I never knew I could feel this way. The words were simple, yet they held the weight of everything we had shared in those hours, a testament to the bond we had discovered. In that quiet moment, we both knew that our lives would never be the same. The boundary between us had been erased, leaving only a path forward that we would have to navigate together. And as we lay there wrapped in each other's warmth, I felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that whatever came next, we would face it side by side. We lay there in a shared silence that felt both grounding and exhilarating, our breaths syncing as dawn's first light began to filter through the windows. The world outside was slowly awakening, but within this room it felt as if time itself had paused. Every now and then he would trace a soft line along my arm or brush a stray strand of hair from my face, his gaze holding a quiet reverence. The intensity of his presence made my heart pound, yet in a way that felt comforting, as though I had finally found a place where I belonged. He sighed deeply, a contented sound, but I sensed something else behind it, a note of uncertainty, perhaps even worry. "I don't think I ever expected this," he admitted, his voice almost inaudible. "You and I were worlds apart in some ways." He paused, his fingers tracing along my shoulder in soft circles. "But here we are." I smiled, catching his gaze, feeling a surge of emotion at his words. "It doesn't matter," I whispered, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the warmth and strength beneath my fingertips. "Sometimes we find what we need in the places we least expect." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring the truth in my words. When he opened them, his gaze was softer, filled with a vulnerability that took my breath away. "You make me want to believe in things I thought I'd left behind," he murmured, his hand brushing a soft path down my arm. "I've spent years burying parts of myself, focusing on work, on responsibilities, and yet here with you, it feels like those walls don't exist." His words stirred something deep within me, a feeling of recognition, a sense that we were both finally allowing ourselves to be seen without pretense. "Maybe we've both been waiting for this," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "Maybe this moment was meant to happen, even if it doesn't make sense." A soft chuckle escaped him, and he shook his head, his hand moving to rest over mine. "You're remarkable, you know that," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "You've reminded me of something I'd forgotten, a part of me I thought was lost." We stayed that way, hands intertwined, as the morning light grew brighter, illuminating the room in a gentle glow. The office, once a place of strict professionalism, had become something intimate, a space where the layers we hid from the world had fallen away. The closeness between us felt more profound than anything I'd known, as though I had found a kindred spirit, someone who understood me in a way that words could never capture. Finally, he sat up and I followed, the reality of our surroundings returning to us. He looked out at the city, his expression pensive, as if gathering his thoughts. "I know that today things will be different," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We both have our lives, our responsibilities." But last night, he turned to face me, his eyes holding an intensity that sent a thrill through me. Last night it felt like a gift, a moment I'll carry with me always. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out," I said, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't expected. "Whatever this means for us, I know it's real, I know it matters." The words felt like a promise, a quiet assurance that no matter what lay ahead, this connection between us would endure. A faint smile touched his lips, and he looked at me with a warmth that melted away any lingering doubt. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you for showing me a part of life I thought I'd left behind." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, a reminder that the world beyond our sanctuary was already in motion. He gave my hand one last squeeze before letting go, a silent acknowledgement of the line we had crossed and the new understanding we now shared. I gathered my things, feeling a bittersweet ache at the thought of leaving this moment behind. Yet, as I glanced back at him, standing there with a gentle smile, I knew that this was only the beginning of a connection that had reawakened something deep within us both. We walked to the elevator in comfortable silence, sharing one last look before stepping into our separate days, each carrying with us the weight and wonder of the night we'd shared. As the elevator doors closed, I felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we had found something rare, something worth holding on to.